All right, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Mari Koeck. I'm the Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Center. And just before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on, or the land we're meeting on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. Now, we've got a lot to talk about tonight. When we scheduled this event, there's a lot of things that have come up in the political cycle that we did not anticipate at all. So there's a lot of ground to cover. One of our panelists is caught in traffic at the moment, so she'll be here and she'll join the panel just as quickly as she can. But due to some of the major world events happening today, Chas has a hard stop at 7:30. So we promise we are going to get him out of here at 7:30, and I think you should all tune in to Planet America tonight on ABC to check it out.
We have to record live. We don't have any computers. We recorded already, but unfortunately we can't play what we recorded. So yeah. So now we need to do it again. Yeah. Except for now with no clips and no graphics and no auto cue. So let's see how that goes.
Yeah. So you don't want to miss it.
This would not be a show that Joe Biden should host. Let's put that
on. So I mean, we are here ostensibly to talk about the Republican National Convention, but there is so much happening and so much that we want to cover tonight. We are definitely going to talk about the events of last weekend with the assassination attempt on former President Trump. And we're going to talk about the party platform, what happened at the RNC, and we'll touch a bit on Joe Biden, but we won't have time to get totally into Joe Biden tonight. So hold if you're excited about that, and I think there's going to be a lot happening on that front too. In about a month, we're doing an event after the DNC. So if you think this week is exciting, let's wait for the TNC to see how that goes. Lots to analyze and discuss. So if you couldn't pick it up already, on the panel tonight, we've got Chas Licciardello, who is host of ABC's Planet America. And for all the people in this room who are, US politics junkies, then make sure you also check out his Planet Extra podcast, PEP, with Chas and Dr. Dave. And that's Dr. David Smith from the US Study Center, who you've seen at some of our events before. So great podcast to check out. And he's across everything. So we're going to pick his, encyclopedic knowledge of US politics tonight and get into a lot of his quick fire reactions to things. We have Jared Mondschein on the panel, who's our Director of Research at the USSC. He also heads up our Politics, Society, and Culture program. It has been an incredibly busy week, and he and his team have just been publishing nonstop, doing media nonstop. They are across all of it. Our third panelist who's going to be joining us is Kim Hoggard, who worked as an assistant press secretary in the Reagan administration. So when we booked her for tonight, we didn't know that her experience in working in Reagan's administration at the time of his assassination attempt would be so relevant for what we're talking about tonight. So we want to wait till she's on the panel before we get into kind of the biggest news from the week. But yes, a lot to cover, a lot to digest. And after the event, we've got some time built in for a bit of networking and some refreshments. So please make sure to stick around for the end. It's a big event in a big election year for the USSC. So we're really grateful that you could come out and join us for this. So the first thing that I wanted to cover was one of the big announcements early in the week. So it was Tuesday, our time, when we finally found out the answer to one of the big questions we had, which we were looking at the VP sweepstakes and who Trump was going to choose to be his running mate on the ticket. And USSC has done a lot of analysis this year and looking at all these different categories of who it might be. Sam Garrett and Ava Kalanaskis on the Politics, Society, and Culture team had done this, VP tracker looking at all the candidates, and they talked about, the loyalists who might make it, and the presidential candidate dropouts who might be on there. And then they had a category they called wild cards. And Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio was classed as one of the wild cards. And now we know that he is the one who Trump has pegged. And of all the potential VPs that they looked at, he has one of probably the biggest impacts on foreign policy and what that means for allies and partners, Australia, around the world, all of that. So let's talk a little bit about J.D. Vance first. I guess, who is he? Why do you think Trump picked him as the first question. What do you guys think?
Sure. Okay. Well, who is he could take a long time. So I'll try and make that as short as possible. He sort of came onto the stage back in 2016. He wrote a book called Hillbilly Elegy, which was the story of his life, essentially. He grew up in, it was Ohio, wasn't it? Ohio he grew up in? Yeah.
The family from Kentucky.
Yeah. Yeah. But he grew up in a very poor town in Ohio. His mother was addicted to drugs. It was a hard scrabble life, but he's a brilliant person. There is no doubt. Whether you like him or hate him, everyone agrees that he is a very, very smart guy. And he ended up getting a scholarship to Yale, and he ended up he joined the Marines for a while. He's had many jobs. He ended up as a venture capitalist with Peter Thiel, who's a billionaire in America as well. And so he's had quite a varied life for someone who's only 39 at this point in time. He ran for Senate 18 months ago, and to be honest, he only barely won. This is kind of I'm jumping ahead a little bit here.
That's great.
But the dog that hasn't barked with him. Like, there's a lot of talk about, is he the future, and we'll get to that. But to be the future, you need to win elections. And while there's no doubt that he is going to play some kind of intellectual role in the future of MAGA, he's pretty much the only person who's made. Actually, I'll jump back. I'll come back to that in a second. In 2016, when the book came out, and he basically got adopted by the middle class. He's our translator for Appalachia. He can explain to us why they like Donald Trump so much.
So he's adopted by the Democratic elite, trying to understand the Trump movement as well, to a certain extent.
Exactly.
Yeah, not just the middle class.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry, yes. And at the time, he was a never-Trumper. And the reason he was a never-Trumper was because his view was that the problem with Appalachia and the poor white working class is that they get distracted by people they can point the finger at, like immigrants, like banks, and like bad guys that they can blame for their lot in life, rather than taking responsibility for themselves. Classic right-wing message, or at the time, a classic right-wing message. But then Trump came along, and he saw Trump, and he said, well, Trump is actually bad for them, because he's given them more people to point the finger at, rather than taking responsibility for their own actions. He thought, I assume, that Trump was going to win the election. Trump was going to lose the election. And so then he would run as the person of personal responsibility, which at the time would seem like a good bet. But Trump won. So then he reinvented himself completely to be the world's greatest MAGA enthusiast. And the thing about him is he's so smart, he's pretty much the only person, quite literally, that I've seen who's actually constructed an intellectually coherent worldview out of MAGA. Like, MAGA is a whole bunch of different bits and pieces and brain F's that Donald Trump has constructed at various times, but he has somehow put them together for some kind of coherent intellectual standard, and which is where we get to now with him, that now he's potentially the vice president of the country, certainly the vice presidential nominee for the Republicans. Trump can use him to launder a lot of his thoughts to make them seem more coherent, and to actually create an intellectual movement out of his warblings.
So he can kind of reverse engineer a policy to give a coherent rationale behind it.
So I took a bit of time to do that. Like I said, it's hard to summarize what this guy's all about, but that is essentially where JD Vance comes from.
Okay. I was going to say, well, on the foreign policy side, because this is one of the things because I was speaking to one of our experts who's a NATO expert this week on our podcast, and it was on the same day that JD Vance was announced. And she was like, because she had just been at the NATO summit in DC last week. Oh, hello, welcome.
Sorry, everybody. Sorry. I'll blame the global outage.
Yeah, we all are, there's a lot going on. Glad you didn't have to get a flight to get here. But on JD Vance, I was chatting with Gorana Gergich as she's just come back from the NATO summit, and she was back in Europe at this time, and she's like, yeah, Europe's freaking out right now, basically around the announcement, because one of the big things that we know about JD Vance is he was kind of leading the side of the Republican Party that's saying we should not fund Ukraine and further aid for Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. So, Jared, I just wanted to get your thoughts in terms of J.D. Vance on the foreign policy side and what that means for allies and partners. What's your take on his appointment?
Yeah, there's a great piece in Politico by Jonathan Martin, who's one of the top sort of reporters on what's going on in politics today. And he talks about how sort of the Reagan era conservatives are really freaking out over J.D. Vance being the nominee. Publicly, they will say, yes, he's great. He's the intellectual future of the MAGA movement, sure. But behind the scenes, they're scared. Now, the question is, what are they scared about? I think they are scared because he is not an isolationist. He's an Asia firster. So he thinks that China is such a big challenge that we, the US, should not be engaging more with NATO, engaging more in Europe, but instead prioritizing everything to deal with China. Now, I think it's really important to note that Asia firster mentality, a lot of times people say it's isolationism. I don't think it is. I think it's Asia first, regardless of whether you agree with it or not. But I think what's really important from my perspective to understand is, why is it that is a Trump and J.D. Vance trashing NATO is an applause line in the US. A lot of people think that this is sort of like a weird Trump phenomenon, like, oh, why is he trashing NATO? Every US president, basically since NATO was created, was frustrated with NATO. They might not have said so nearly as publicly as Donald Trump has, but they've all been frustrated, whether it be Republicans or Democrats, including Barack Obama. They were all frustrated because time and time again, especially since the end of the Cold War, NATO allies have not paid what they said they would pay for military expenditures. They have relied on the US for military expenditures to provide that security umbrella to Europe. So a lot of, I just want to make that one point, that it's a Asia firster mentality, but also there is, I think, some substance to the argument that Europe has not pulled its weight. Right now, like even now, we're seeing the first land war in Europe since World War II. And we've all heard maybe that 2% line about military expenditures. You should be spending at least 2% of your GDP on the military to show that you're really, putting skin in the game and not just relying on the US and free riding. Right now, first land war since World War II, and Europe and Germany's military expenditure is still not at 2%. It's still less than 2%. Yes, they are paying more in energy. Yes, they are giving lots of aid to Ukraine. But on the military side, they're not doing what they all pledged they would be doing. So I think it's important to note that, yes, Trump says the quiet part out loud and more aggressively, and as does J.D. Vance, but the European component of the American grievances with the alliance system overseas is very European centric. It is not something that I think applies nearly as much to Asia, where if you look at Australia and Japan, Americans have overwhelmingly far more support for those alliances than they do towards NATO.
Could I just make the point very quickly as well, that it's even worse than you just suggested, Jared, because I'm talking about the delinquency of the European nations, because it's not just that even now a number of them haven't hit 2%, but the way they define that 2% is full of loopholes. Like they define the military expenditure as anything that relates to the military whatsoever. Pensions for retired soldiers, for veterans, is counted in the 2%. Aircraft radar is counted in the 2%. Telecommunications is counted in the 2%. Things that are used by the military, but then used by civilian applications as well, is counted in 2%. So you take Germany, for instance, which is, I think from memory, is 1.6%, I think, off the top of my head.
It's gone up to 1.8.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah. They only 2 years ago, they were training using broomsticks, quite literally, instead of rifles in their training drills. And the reason for that is because a huge proportion of their 1.6 or 1.8% is pensions. Like it's not in military spending. So there are some European countries that are really dragging the chain. Not all of them, like Poland's going crazy, but But yeah, some of them are really having a lend of America. So just to make that point.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the most notable things about J.D. Vance as a now vice presidential nominee is what you said about him, Chaz. He's 39. He turns 40 in a couple of weeks, but he is half the age of his running mate. And this is remarkable. I mean, if this trend continues, then in terms of vice presidential candidates, they've skipped over Generation X completely and have just gone straight to millennials. Which we knew that about J.D. Vance, ahead of this week, but it hits differently because of the events of last weekend, because there was, this close brush with death for one of the presidential candidates. And now Biden has COVID and he seems to be fairly sick. These questions around the frailty of these candidates and therefore the importance of their running mates, it just hits differently. So I do want to just I want to reflect on the assassination attempt that happened last week on the weekend. And I guess, Kim, I'd like to hear from your perspective first. I've told everyone about your background with the Reagan administration already. And he was the last, presidential candidate or president who was shot in a public event. And just as 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, truly shocking. Can you talk us through what that experience was like working in the Reagan administration when this massive upheaval happens? And what were you thinking when you heard about that Trump was shot?
Well, I immediately was thinking of March 30th, 1981, because, as you just pointed out, this doesn't happen very often, although I'll point out every president has a lot of threats and a lot of threats that are foiled. But Reagan was only 3 months into his first term. So it was just a very new presidency, and it was completely new kind of experience, all of us getting our feet on the ground. A transition from one government to the other is probably the most ridiculous system and chaotic system. I think I couldn't believe it. You literally walk in to the White House, a place you may or may not have seen prior in the transition, at high noon on Inauguration Day, and literally the Carter staff, who were the last remaining staff in the White House press office, got up from their desks and walked out the door. And we arrived at the time when the American hostages were in Iran for 444 days, however much it was, and were being released. And so I came into the lower press office, not even knowing exactly where my office was yet, not knowing where the restroom was yet. And I had there were cameras all in the briefing room, the press office, the press secretary's office, so many press just for an inauguration day, but because of the Iranian hostages, amplified it. Lots of foreign media had a French camera stick into my face and go and ask me, have the American hostages left Iranian airspace yet? And I just looked at him and said, I don't know where the photocopier is yet, so I can't answer that question. But that's just chaotic, just very odd. So the first 3 months, you're really finding your feet, and here we're just finding our feet. And this terrible event happened when he's speaking to a branch of the AFL-CIO, and actually, as he was leaving,
AFL-CIO
is a trade union. So again, not necessarily a trade union that would be pro-Republican. And he was walking back to the exit outside the hotel and commented to one of the staff. He thought that was a bit flat, the audience. He said, I guess they're all Democrats in there. So he wasn't happy with it. But yes, as he was exiting the building, there was a rope line of reporters and cameras waiting for him to exit, to just watch him go into his motorcade. And that's when the shots were fired. John Hinckley was in that press area behind the rope line. It was just a simple rope line. Of course, that incident changed security for the president immediately after that. And most times then he didn't enter or exit from an exterior location as little as possible, always from the interior. And I'm sure that's for the Trump Secret Service, it must be very difficult for them because he likes his outdoor rallies and you're so exposed. And I felt for those agents because I know the investigations that take place, the finger pointing that takes place. It's traumatic for everyone. It would be traumatic for the staff, particularly. You don't get protected. Only the principal gets protected. I was aware of that from the very beginning and places we would go and things, you know, bomb sniffer dogs and all of that. You think, well, the protection's great, but it's for that guy, not for me. So yeah, it was a very disturbing day to see that. And the difference with that one is we watched it live on camera. So much of what happens in our world today is live streamed, horrific acts of violence. And this was just, I think, such a statement of the times that we live in now, that we were all able to watch that, and then to see the video over and over again is distressing. And it certainly was distressing for me to watch this happen. Whatever you think of President Trump and his policies, this is just not something we want to see in America. It's such a volatile, violent place to begin with. It's a country with more guns than people, and very serious weapons that are legal. So, you know, I can't get my head wrapped around how President Trump had the presence of mind to duck and then to get up and in that flash of defiance had the clarity of mind. And he explained it in his speech today, but to have the clarity of mind to stand and show people that he was okay, but to have that defiant, you know, approach and attitude and calling for people to fight. And it's an iconic photo. It'll go down in American, world history, really.
Can I just add, I think what Kim said is perfectly spot on. And I particularly loved how you said there's always been threats against the president. And she has a great piece in the ABC, if folks haven't seen that yet, about her experience there. But I'll also flag, though, one thing that really, really frustrated me as an American, I think, as Kim said, regardless of what you think of Trump, the fact that that attack happened at all. Every single president, Reagan was the last president to get shot in the US, but he was by no means the only president to have threats. Every single president since Reagan has had threats, and every single president since Reagan has had those threats mitigated. Some of the most well-known ones weren't even mitigated. So in Georgia, in Tbilisi, Georgia, George W. Bush was on stage, someone threw a grenade and it malfunctioned and didn't explode. Barack Obama has a whole Wikipedia page on the number of threats he had against him in office that were mitigated against. But the fact that there was someone with an AR-15 within 140 meters of the president, as an American, I was furious. Like, that's just unacceptable. This should have never happened. To me, I took it less as a sign that we somehow reached worse levels of political violence than ever, as more of just another crazy guy who should have been prevented from being anywhere near there. It was a security failure more than anything else. That was my top takeaway from that entire experience.
Just to pick up on that, I feel like, I mean, I can't get in the brain of people being polled in America at the moment. I don't know what they look for, but from my perspective, I feel like one of the broken promises of the Biden administration was I mean, he made this promise explicitly, but it was even louder, an implicit promise that, okay, showtime's over. It's time for the professionals to come back, who are going to make this place work, right? This was in the middle of COVID, remember? And the whole place was chaotic. And it's like, okay, remember how things ran pretty well under Obama? We'll run pretty well again. Come on, we're getting serious again. The adults are back in charge. And I feel like one after another bureaucrat is stuffed up under Biden. There's been a whole series of agencies not performing the way they're meant to. And I feel like this is the latest example.
For what? What do you
like for instance, the way they struggled with supply chain snafus, the transportation department, coming out code, for instance.
Mm.
Like I could go on forever, but in this case here, the Secret Service, it's not the fact that he got shot at. I mean, that's not good, but it's the fact that 40 minutes before the shooting, the target, the shooter, had been identified as behaving strangely with a rangefinder.
Absolutely.
That can only be used to scope someone out to shoot them. I would have thought, as soon as you see someone behaving strangely with a rangefinder, it's time to arrest that person.
I was
And
just
not the
asking about the other agencies that you were
Oh, yeah,
complaining about.
okay. Well,
Definitely, I
Yeah,
agree
yeah.
about the security
Well,
lapses,
I
but
mean, yeah,
I wouldn't criticize all of the government
I'm
for,
not saying the entire government.
yeah.
I'm saying, I mean, like, I don't want to
Well,
waste people's time, but
yeah.
like, like the FBI's had all kinds of problems. I'm talking about, like, I'm not saying every single one, but I feel like this is probably the 4th or 5th time when there's been a massive stuff up. And I feel like that is part of the Democrats' problem at the moment, that Donald Trump is now running as a stability agent. And you wouldn't have thought that would have happened 4 years ago.
Well, and so this to one point, when I, witnessed and found out what was going on, and then you see those images emerge, like the first thought that I had was, this changes everything. This changes everything that we thought we knew about the race. It changes the perceptions of Trump and Biden in comparison, and we're going into the convention. It's going to change everything. I guess I'm keen to know, on the broader perceptions issue, or how this affects the campaign, what is your hot take on, now that he's survived this assassination attempt, how do you think this impacts the campaign going forward?
Well, several levels it'll affect it. Obviously, it's affected the Republican National Convention right away. I mean, we've just seen sort of the second coming of Christ being, I mean, I don't mean to be rude, because he's been through a traumatic, terrible experience. And I do think that for him, because he's such an image conscious person, and that was evident in the photo that he created, I think it was interesting watching him come into the convention on the first day. Amazing that he would even show up and not take a day to really process what had just happened to him. It was almost as if it was a tonic for him, I think, to sit there and listen to everyone over the last 4 days. He was very subdued. He appeared very vulnerable in his first appearance. Not like the strong man that we are used to, that he projects. He stands very straight. He's very, forward thrusting in his body movement. But this one was very different. And I think a lot of what will happen will come from the security standpoint. Certainly, we don't need to go into all that. It's predictable what will happen. That'll ramp up to the nth degree. And there's always tensions between staff and the candidate or the president and security. We had ongoing, head knocks with security. Candidates want it, particularly those who are gregarious. Not that I see Trump doing rope lines much. He's not much of a handshaker. Biden loves that. He loves to get out amongst people. It really limits their ability to connect. And most of these candidates or these presidents, they need to connect with people. They feed off of it. And I do think that while the convention provided a safe, secure, everyday place that security could get their get everything in position to protect him. When he goes back to doing his rallies, this is going to be very interesting, because they're going to want him to do them indoors. And he doesn't like indoors because he doesn't like seeing empty seats. It's really important for him to have, this is the biggest, he said it at the convention, it's the biggest convention, biggest audience ever, everything's the biggest and the best. So that affects him and how he operates. But, Reagan had to wear a bulletproof vest. Security was insistent upon it. He hated it. And, they'll say to him, like they said to Trump after the January 6th rally, in which everyone chuffed off to the Capitol under his orders. And he wanted to go up there. And the report from Cassidy Hutchinson was he tried to maneuver the Secret Service to let him up there, and they refused. And that's what they'll do at the end of the day. They will refuse, even though they're the president of the United States. If they feel there's a real threat, they'll refuse. Like Reagan wanted to go back to the White House, and Jerry Parr, the lead agent, didn't know at that moment that he was shot. In fact, Reagan thought Jerry had broken his ribs because he thrust him into the car with such force that, you know, he felt this pain, but the pain was from the bullet. And then it wasn't until Jerry Parr realized, because blood was coming out of his mouth when he coughed, that something serious had happened, and then he changed direction. But Reagan initially wanted to go to the White House. Let's just go back. No, we're going to the hospital. So that they'll lay some ground rules on the security part, but really how the principal himself decides, okay, I'm going to wear a bulletproof vest. No, I'm not. Depending on, and the case of Nancy Reagan, she took to astrology. She was so freaked out by it and so afraid.
Is that what started the astrology?
Yes. So, you know, it depends on how they react to it as well, but it will certainly limit his ability to be amongst people and in certain venues.
I think in terms of the result, right? I completely agree with what Kim was just saying about how it affected Trump's movements and Biden's movements for that matter. But in terms of the result, this might sound strange. I'm not sure it's going to make much difference to the result. And the reason I'll say that is because I feel like in America, it's just this fire hose, this deluge of news all the time, that the biggest stories in the world, 2 weeks later, you're moving on to another story. And the stories that really make a difference, the ones that keep on taking bites over and over again, like a repetitive story. There's a drip. Like in 2016, the reason the emails killed Hillary so much was they never stopped. There was just one after another. And then finally, with a week to go, there was the reopening the investigation as well. Whereas this story, there's going to be the hearings with the Secret Service director, but beyond that, there is no second, third, fourth bite, hopefully.
Well, and Trump has said so in his speech today. He said, I'm going to describe this once, and I'm not going to talk about it again because it's too painful.
Totally. And so when the next crazy thing happens in American politics, which can only be hours away, we're just going to move on. And I feel like already, like around the office, we're talking about Joe Biden. We're talking like that, like in 48 hours, that's what we're going to be talking about. We ain't going to be talking about the assassination.
Well, it really did overshadow the President Trump's speech today.
Yeah,
yes,
totally. And the reason why the Joe Biden story is so damaging for the Democrats because there is one of those drip stories. There's another leak. There's another story, and that's the reason he has to go. Like I know you didn't ask that. The reason he has to go is because it will never end. If he stays president until the election, it'll be 4 months of drip. That will never end. It'll be the emails all over again. But that aside, I could go ahead of myself there. Even after that, there'll be another story. For that reason, I think there's no doubt that Trump's image has been, I think, improved as a result of both the way he dealt with it and the immediate aftermath and just general sympathy, etc. I don't think it's going to win him votes in 3 months' time because I think the story's going to keep on coming.
I would agree with that because the difference between this assassination attempt, I can't believe I'm saying this, and the Reagan assassination attempt was that Reagan was in office already, so it wasn't during the campaign. There wasn't the political division. I mean, there were obviously two sides of the aisle and different opinions and heated arguments, but there wasn't this polarization that exists now in the United States. So he actually benefited in terms of sympathy and empathy, but also politically, because his popularity ratings went through the roof. And it was his own response to the shooting that reassured Americans and the world when he said things like when his wife came into the hospital and he said to her, honey, I forgot to duck. And then when the surgeon was about to put him on, under, he said, well, I hope you're a Republican. And, the doctor said, well, we're all Republicans today, Mr. President. So all these lines we got out to the public, and they were hearing directly from him. Even in that moment, even like Trump, in that moment, they realize that the world is watching. How am I going to react to that? And they had the foresight and the presence of mind. And in Reagan's case, it was humor. But that goodwill lasted all year long. They always talk about a honeymoon period in a presidency. When you first come in, there's a bit of a, good feeling going on. I don't think that happened in the Trump administration, but for Reagan, it lasted all year, and he passed some significant economic legislation, bipartisan, during that year, because Democrats realized that, well, his popularity's through the roof. We're just going to go with this. And in fact, despite what Donald Trump says, it was Ronald Reagan that passed the biggest tax cut in American history. But that goodwill lasted for him. I agree that with Trump, this is so different now. People are in their camps. And so while the country for a day, felt a lot of sympathy and expressed the sympathy, and we need to tone it down, the rhetoric, we need to, calm the divide. Well, it didn't last long. It certainly didn't last long at the Republican convention. And even Donald Trump tried in his speech today to say things like, we need to end the division. I'm going to be the president for all America, not half America, and then spent the rest of his time, doing exactly the opposite. So the goodwill just is not going to be there, I don't think, now.
And I think so we've talked about a few things that I do want to think about. Like, so where we did see a very clear change was in the convention. We saw a lot of the messaging different, and even I knew with Trump and how he had this iconic image right away. I knew we'd be seeing that a lot, and I was thinking, what sort of bandage is he going to wear on his ear? And I remember thinking, is the bandage he wears going to become a thing? And then I saw photos of people wearing white bandages on their ear by the end of the convention. So at the convention, we did see this. And one of the things that you've mentioned already, Kim, I think you said it was like the second coming of Jesus Christ, like the religious messaging at the convention. I've watched a lot of these conventions, Republican and Democrat. And yes, there's always religion involved in some way. In US politics, it's a thing. It's very different to Australia. But I've never seen it like this. Why do you guys, like, what did you pick up on in terms of anything on the, the religious messaging that was particularly notable, and why do you think they had, I guess, the political cover to be that much more overt than we've seen previously?
Look, I'd say that I think religion has been pretty tied up with Trump well before this. I think that the fact that America is dividing politically along religious lines is part of that. I think that because that didn't used to be the case, that's becoming more over time. I think that as well as that, there is a religious overtone to his message, well before the assassination attempt of "I alone can fix it." Like the number of times I've heard, like that phrase he likes to use, "They're not coming after you, they're coming after me. I'm standing away." There's a very religious overtone to that. He does like to paint himself as a Christ-like figure.
He's persecuted.
Yeah, very much the persecution. So I think that it was already set up. And then on top of that, you've got it's a miracle element of the avoiding the assassination, which he also likes to play up. And there's also the religious iconography of sacrificing for your followers, sacrificing with actual blood in this case, which has been played up as well. I mean, I personally find it slightly distasteful, given that someone died, and this idea that it's a miracle that he died, it's God's will that he died. Yeah, they don't make that connection, and so I don't like that. But I guess that's the way PR works. Sometimes you just ignore the elements you want to ignore. But yeah, I think Trump was set up for that even before the assassination. So that's why I think slipped on so nicely in the Republican convention. Sorry, did you want to jump in on that? Or otherwise,
Just a messianic figure, you know, and he appeals to the evangelical base in the United States. And that's an important element to his whole politicking. And for him, it never quite sits with me that it's genuine coming from him, but because, you know, Ronald Reagan, when you talk about what the effect of that assassination attempt, he was a churchgoer, but he stopped going to church because he his explanation was he didn't want to put parishioners at risk or the inconvenience of having to go through magnetometers, because that's when that got introduced. Magnetometers or wands, security wands, or anything like that. So he stopped going.
His anti-communism was, a lot of it was capitalism to a certain extent, but a lot of it was religious. When he engaged with the Soviets and persecuted minorities, Reagan really did believe in that religious message. And it was really important. He was constantly talking about freeing imprisoned religious minorities around the world.
Yes, and this is why he wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons too.
Yeah.
He found purpose. This is the other thing about assassination attempts. He wrote in his diaries. He's the only president who's actually kept a diary for every single day he was in office, except for the period he was in the hospital during recovering from the bullet wounds. But he wrote in his diary that he found a purpose. God had saved him for a purpose. And that purpose was to improve relationships with the Soviet Union, to end the Cold War, and to reduce nuclear weapons. And, you know, he had the famous chat with Gorbachev, one-on-one with the interpreters. And he suggested, much to the horror of military, US military, and I'm sure the Russian, Soviet military, he suggested, why don't we eliminate all nuclear weapons? And I don't, you go look it up, because it just went viral, if whatever could go viral in that day. But it was a crazy story, because people are, what is this man saying? This is ridiculous. You can't, what are you doing saying you're going to get rid of nuclear weapons? And this is the candidate that everybody painted as the one that was going to push the button. So that was his purpose. So what is Donald Trump? Does he have he's had a near-death experience. What is going to be his purpose? Is this going to reinvigorate him, you know, to carry out his America First agenda?
Very quickly, before going back to Chas, it's really important if you look at the polling, and Chas very correctly talks about the divisions along religious lines. And I think the polarization in America is one thing, but also the calcification of that polarization is also really worrying, how the numbers don't change no matter how crazy things get. But if you look deep down at the polls and the religious breakdown, it's really interesting how there's a difference between people who self-identify as evangelical versus people who go to church every week. People who go to church every week are actually less likely to support Trump than self-identifying evangelicals, which I think is telling of the political era we're in, which is about identity more than anything else.
I was just going to add that for me, the thing that stood out most from the convention wasn't a religious thing. For me, it was a few speakers who had unusual prominence who just would not have been there under any other president. Like, I mean, J.D. Vance would not have been anyone else's vice president. Like, no one else would pick a dude who's been a senator for 18 months and that's it. He's the least experienced vice presidential nominee since 1936.
Well, Obama became president and he wasn't.
No, I know.
Senator.
But usually when they can handpick their vice presidential nominee, usually the vice president, there's plenty of presidents who didn't have much experience. Usually the vice president has quite a lot. So that's a very unusual pick. It's a Trump pick, right? A union guy, a Teamster guy was the keynote speaker on night one. He spent, not just was he the keynote speaker, he spoke for 17 minutes. And I reckon 12 of those minutes was him droning on about the particulars of unions. and those Republicans, they didn't understand any of it. They just went quiet for about 6 minutes there. They're saying, oh, what's this? Like he just gave the unions a free ad on primetime TV.
Well, and he spoke after some big, like corporate people were up on the stage as well.
Yeah.
So there were big corporates and then
Yeah.
they had a union guy.
Yeah, only Trump would have done that.
And he actually hadn't endorsed Trump either.
No.
No.
No, absolutely. Amber Rose, who could not be more pro-choice, right? Like she could not be more pro-choice. She has a face tattoo. She's known as an OnlyFans model. She literally had a 50% discount on her OnlyFans site while she was speaking there.
Oh my God.
Like, that is only Trump.
Oh, I didn't know that. Too
Yeah.
much information.
Only Trump would pick that person as a speaker in prime time. And to be honest, I actually think she was one of the best speakers of the entire 4 days. I think it really paid off. I think she was extremely effective. And I don't know who's watching on day one, but if there were people, persuadable voters watching on day one, she would have persuaded some people. She was effective. And that is a classic Trump pick. So that to me was the stuff that stood out the most during this convention. But like Trump putting his imprint of being a very, very different kind of Republican. He's still pulling it off, even 8 years later.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly add, if we talk about how JD Vance is sort of the heir to the MAGA throne and all this stuff, if JD Vance does run for president, I sincerely doubt that he would be touting corporate tax cuts in the way that Trump does, or have Amber Rose on stage. It's really important to differentiate the difference between MAGA and Trump. And I think there's the MAGA movement, as Chas said, who JD Vance puts that intellectual firmament around it and provides some sort of coherence to it. But Trump's ideology is not coherent otherwise. And so I think there are very Trumpian aspects of his candidacy and his platform that really can only belong to him and no one else.
That's because he's a showman.
Well, he is a showman. And the next thing I wanted to talk about is what we have touched on a little bit, but today we watched, the culmination of the whole convention is we had, Trump's acceptance speech. He accepts the nomination and then he speaks. And I remember in the office today, and a Teams chat, I said something about like, oh, he's winding up to go for 90 minutes about something. And I thought I was like being hyperbolic. And he went for 91 or 92 minutes. Yeah. I was like, oh, wow. Like, okay, it was the Trump show. Today was the Trump show. This whole week has led up to it. He started off, he had this line that the first thing when he said it, I was like, oh, that reminded me of Biden's speech when he said, I'm running to be president for all of America, not half of America. And Biden had said something, that's the job of the president. We represent, all of us, not just the base of our party or our party. So he started off with this messaging where it was like he had previewed this in advance of the event, saying he was going to rewrite his whole speech. Although I wonder how much was actually written. But he was going to rewrite it all, and it was going to be about, this message of unity, and it was going to be this new Trump. So there were clearly lines in there that hit on that. But do you think, has he reinvented himself as this unity candidate, or does he have now, the mantle to be able to say, oh, now all of America's behind me and I rule for, this would be for all of us and I'm uniting all of us. Did that land? And was it a changed Trump that we saw?
Well, John Barron, my co-host of Planet America, and I had quite a passionate disagreement about this, in that John just thought it was a garbage speech from beginning to end. But whereas I actually thought there were two distinct parts to this. And I thought the first part, in my view, was incredibly effective. And the second part was incredibly self-indulgent and undermined the first part. The first part, where he was talking about his experience with the shooting. Yes, it wasn't beautifully written. It wasn't written in poetry. That is true. Right? It's Jim Fallows could have written a better speech. Yes, that is true. But what it was a very different Donald Trump to what we've seen before. He was restrained. He was grateful. Like he was expressing genuine gratitude to the people in the bleachers who were pointing to it, rather than running away, was standing and pointing to where the shooter was. He was expressing awe in the situation. Now, he
Was also reading off of the teleprompter.
No, I know. Well, there's a big difference as well. So the second part, but my point is, I actually would never have used this word ever in 8 years of Donald Trump. He was humble at times.
Yeah.
He actually, in fact, there was one moment which really stood out to me when he said something which I forgot what the words were. Something that was important to him, and the crowd started to do their chant, and he talked over their chant. I've never seen him not bask in applause.
Well, that's because he said, I'm not meant to be here.
That's
Yeah.
And they said, yes, you are.
Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
And then he said, but I'm not.
Yeah.
But I'm not supposed
And I thought that was so effective. And I was thinking to myself, those of us who are obsessed with politics, we've seen Trump and Biden like every single day for the last X years. There are people in America who switch off and switch back on when it comes to convention time, and they've been paying no attention for years. They switched on tonight and they saw the first part of that speech. They're going, this is a different guy. This is not the guy I remember. He's not a braggart anymore. He's matured. He's got a new perspective. This is a new person. He's not scary. I could see it being really effective that first half, even though it's not a wonderful speech. The tone would have really surprised me if I was just a casual viewer. But then there was 60 minutes of just
Trump rally.
just rambling. Yeah, just the usual kind of rally where he was just talking crap. He had maybe 4 dot points on his auto cue, and he was just going for it, saying things everyone's heard a million times before that meant nothing. They're all over the place. It was completely incoherent, and I think it actually felt like a waste of my time as a viewer. Like if I was at home, I'd feel insulted. I'd go, couldn't you even bother working on this? Like it seemed like he just didn't care. Yeah, and it's just, and I thought that by the time that 92 minutes was finished, I was half forgetting the first half. And I wish he'd just if I was his manager, I would have said, do your 30 minutes on that and then be really short and then get the hell out of there. You would have surprised them. You would have really surprised them.
But it's all about the show. And he's been watching it every day. He's had a hand in how it looks. I mean, it's the first time I've ever seen on a convention platform stage the backdrop of the White House. They've got it superimposed in the background. So, and then when he came out, they had his name, Trump, like it was the name of his hotel, and blaring lights stand. It was, he's going to think it looks great. And when the red, white, and blue balloon, the balloon drop came at the end, they had to throw in some gold ones because he just a Trumpian gold. So, he made a point of talking about how wonderful everyone spoke. He was so impressed. No one blew it. So he said, I can't blow it. I've got to get onto a good speech here because everyone's done such a good job. And he's so competitive, he wants to be the best speaker. But he knows how well orchestrated it was. He thought it was entertaining, and he thought people on the floor of the hall were having fun all week long. And they really tried to project this image of fun, happy, we're united, because in past conventions, in recent past Republican conventions, they haven't been united. But I agree with how you're describing the speech in 2 parts. I do think it went on way too long for the people, particularly standing there, and for East Coast Americans, they were going to bed. This is in Central Time Zone, so it's quite late. Now, he likes staying up late, but, everybody else has got to go to work the next day. So, I think he did go up, but he did hit some incredible things that he said in the speech. So I would suggest you watch it and listen to it or read the transcript, because, he mentions, who does he mention? He mentions all the dictators. He mentions Viktor Orban. He mentions Kim Jong-un, and he says, oh, he misses me because, they used to write love letters, He mentions everyone, and that not as if they're a threat necessarily, but then he does mention potentially there's World War III, and he says things like Russia's got, nuclear subs down in Cuba. This wouldn't happen. Some of it's quite escalatory. So it's a very important speech in my mind. Not that anybody's the ratings for this have been quite low, and the people that are watching it, apparently they're on Fox News. Because if you look at the ratings for CNN and MSNBC, they're barely getting 1 million viewers. Fox News is getting over 5 million viewers a night. So that's telling you the bubble is still there. And this is not really transmitting out to everyone else, although they'll read it later. But yeah, to him, it's the show. I've got to do this speech, and I've got to do it better than everyone, and I've got to make everybody happy with the final product. And he wants to have the last, picture of all the family. It's so much imagery involved for him. But yes, he was subdued, and the speech, I thought in the beginning, was very dry. It was just sort of this literal thing of what happened. And he kept talking about the chart that he turned to look at. I don't know if anybody saw the speech, but it's quite incredible, because then he said, oh, if it wasn't for that chart, I love this chart because it shows how much better, I forget what the chart was about.
Immigration, I think.
Immigration, yeah, how much lower it was than under Biden. I love this chart. And then all of a sudden the chart appears behind him, in 5 different places behind him. And he turns and says, oh, there's the chart. I love this chart, and he thought that was great to have this chart showing. But I don't think that going forward, there's going to be much more mileage out of this, because conventions happen. They're very colorful. They're very loud. The Democrats are freaking out because they look so happy. But in a couple of days, another story, and back to the campaign.
And Jared?
The one thing that I keep looking at the convention as well as his VP choice is how much is Donald Trump trying to branch beyond his base? And is he trying to win over new converts? And I saw, 15 minutes of him trying to do that by showing a humility that he's really never shown before. But then I saw another 65 minutes after that of him just doing his stump speech. Oh, basically, I don't know if he said anything new in his speech after the first 15 minutes we hadn't heard before. He's made comments about Cuba before. He's made comments about Kim Jong-un before. He's made comments about Viktor Orban before. That was all just a lazy stump speech. And he had the audience of the world, America, a unique opportunity, and he just mailed it in. And so I think that, to me, is telling utmost confidence. I don't actually need to try that hard because it is my election to lose at this point. And it's the same message I got from picking JD Vance. I don't need an electoral winner. I mean, again, I can't emphasize how good Chaz's point about JD Vance's past electoral weaknesses, how significant that was. He won by what, 2 percentage points? The Ohio governor won by 9, I believe, who's a Republican, and the past Republicans or other Republicans in that election won way better than JD Vance was. He was defined as being lazy and just a terrible campaigner and not a good messenger. And so, but Trump was like, no, I'm going to double down. I'm going to get the MAGA heir, and I'm going to put him on my ticket because I don't need women. I don't need non-white voters. I don't need suburban voters. I'm just going to get my guy. Because it's my election to lose.
And they want the working class, and they think he can bring in some working class, which is ironic given he was funded by Peter Thiel, to win that Senate campaign. And I think that's the other attraction for Trump is fundraising. Vance can bring in some Silicon Valley money.
I was good, just because I happen to have the numbers here because I was preparing this for my podcast. But the numbers are quite funny, so I was reading them out just quickly to pick on your point. When Vance ran the Senate in Ohio 2 years ago, in 2022, he won with 53.4% of the vote, okay? DeWine, the governor, won with 62.4% of the vote. The Attorney General, the Republican, won with 60.1% of the vote. The Secretary of State, Republican, won with 59.3% of the vote. The Treasurer, Republican, won with 58.6% of the vote. The Chief Judge of the State Supreme Court won with 56.1% of the vote. The Associate Judges of the State Supreme Court won 56.9% and 56.3%, all Republicans. Across the House races in Ohio, if you average them out, the Republicans won 56.4% of the vote. Across the state House races, if you average them out, 59.3% of the vote. And if you average out the state Senate races, 57.4% of the vote. So he literally did worse than every other Republican in Ohio 18 months ago.
No, and it also shows that Ohio's definitely not a swing state.
No. So in fact, something which I flagged before, I might mention later on, we're talking about he needs to win an election. I'll tell you my theory on JD Vance, even though I think he's very smart. I think he is the white working class version of Tim Scott. And what I mean by that is Tim Scott is the person that people in Washington think black people want to vote for. He talks about black people a lot. Black people don't vote for him. Black people don't like Tim Scott. And he's made a name out of being, oh yeah, get Tim Scott on if you want black people. No, they don't like him. And I think JD Vance is that for white working class people. I think he talks white working class people constantly. He talks all about all their issues. He knows what to say, but they don't vote for him. They don't like him. I reckon they resent hillbilly elegy. I reckon I reckon that they can tell he dumped them to move up to Peter Thiel and everyone else, and they resent it. I mean, the votes don't lie. So that's my prediction as we go forward. They're going to keep on saying, oh, he's Mr. White working class, but he ain't going to get their votes.
Well, so the last topic I want to hit on before we open it up to audience questions, because I want to make sure we've got time for some of that before we have to let Chas go, is, I guess, where to from here? So you've talked a little bit about, is Trump going to win, the whole of, the United States? Can he branch outside of his base? But I guess from between now and the election, what do we need to be watching, or what are you expecting to see?
Can I answer this in 72 hours? That's it. It really depends what Biden does this weekend. If Biden runs, I think it's pretty clear what's going to happen. It's not going to be great. Let's not forget, in 2016, Trump overshot the polls. In 2020, he again overshot the polls, except the margin that he overshot was not enough to eclipse Joe Biden. So ultimately, what decided the vote in 2016? 75,000 votes spread across 3 states. That's how the Electoral College works. 2020, 45,000 votes spread across 3 states. So it was, I think if Biden stays, that's why I want to answer this in 72 hours. If he stays, then it's a landslide. Your state of Minnesota very well may turn Republican. My adopted state of Maine may go Republican as well. That they were not even in contention a month ago. Literally just a month ago, before the debate, we were not even considering this as a possibility. But if we do have a different candidate, somehow there's so many options moving ahead. A lot of people are asking, what can the Democrats do if Biden steps down? And I'll just say that there are contingency plans for Biden dying. We know the Democratic Party has very clear lines on what to do there. Him deciding to not run, very different ballgame altogether, because it depends what he does. Does he say Kamala should be my heir apparent? She can take all my money? Or does he say, actually, I think we should have an open primary? It really is, the world is their oyster. It's just, they can pursue the next steps however they want. So I can't really speak on what happens next, but I will say, if they do somehow get a new Democratic candidate at the top of the ticket, that makes it way more competitive than it is right now.
I'd say that to answer directly your question from before, I don't think Trump's vote is going to change no matter what happens. I think Trump is going to get exactly the same number of voters. There is exactly X number of people in America who are going to vote for Trump no matter what happens. The question is, how many votes do the Democrats get? What's their turnout? That's the question. Now, I think the Democrats have got themselves in a really tough situation where I agree with Jared about what's going to happen if Biden stays. But I think they got their own problem if Biden goes. And that is, Biden did have I shouldn't say did, he's still there. But Biden does have a secret weapon, which isn't good enough for him at the moment because he's in too much trouble since that debate. But he still has it. And that secret weapon is old voters. The Democrats have never had. But they're winning old voters with Joe Biden, which is unheard of, that they're winning it. Not just as they're close, but they're winning old voters. So in some polls, they're winning it by 9 points, old voters. Why is old voters so special? Because they vote. They turn up. Unlike the kids who never turn up, the old people turn up. And so that is his secret weapon. He can afford to have less enthusiasm and not such a big number as a percentage of each demographic, as long as he does pretty well with the oldies, they make up for a lot of weaknesses. So if the thing which I'm looking for going forward, if he's replaced, is can the Democrats keep the old vote? If they can keep the old vote, if they can keep Biden's old voters, then I think they can be competitive. I think there's something about Biden and old voters. I think we probably know what it is.
But also, let's be honest, he's been in DC for half a century at this point, and he's been called a weather vane for the middle of the Democratic Party for good reason. The as much as Trump really unites his base, he also unites a never Trump base that is way more diverse than that Trump base. So Biden is uniquely talented through both political maneuvering as well as personal engagement at uniting a diverse coalition. Let's not forget, in 2016, Bernie Sanders stayed almost until the convention as a middle finger to Hillary Clinton. He did not do that in 2020, maybe because he was scared of Trump, but also because he legitimately likes Joe Biden, because Joe Biden is smart enough to always take the meeting with his opponents, with people he may disagree with. He's a uniquely talented, or was perhaps at this point, a uniquely talented politician. And so who can actually succeed that to be palatable to that very diverse but passionate never Trump coalition is really hard. Right now, we can do this later, but if I had to choose anyone, the only person that I see being able to be close to this, although they have not been nationally tested, is Mark Kelly in Arizona. But anyways, sorry, we're jumping ahead.
Well, on that hot take, I think I will open it up to the audience voters, or audience voters. You get out your phones, let's vote for the winner. If you have a question, I'd love to, there's so much to unpack there, so we'll try to get as many questions in as we can in the time that we've got. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone to you. Yeah, why don't we start with the lady there? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Fiona Paul and I'm a local. So, and I love coming to these things. It's just so wonderful. I heard that Kamala Harris challenged JD Vance to a debate. So how do you think that would go?
Who wants to take it first?
I can answer that very quickly. I mean, you guys might disagree with me. I think JD Vance would absolutely destroy her. I think he's a great debater, and I don't think she's a great debater. Tulsi Gabbard disemboweled her in the Democrat primary in 2016, 2020. Yeah. No, I think JD Vance will have his way with it. I don't think she'll get close, but we'll see. It may well be.
I'm not prepared to make that bold prediction. You know, she was the Attorney General of California. She's prosecutor for many, many years. What has he done in the law? He's worked in a hedge fund. You know, she's used to prosecuting the argument. And now she's had 4 years of experiences nearly as vice president. Of course, she was a senator for many more years than your guy.
I just said he's never going to win an election.
I'm not sure about JD Vance in the sense that he's, like I said earlier, he's a shapeshifter. And when I watched his speech yesterday, I thought there was some sophomoric sort of inexperience in some of how he was presenting his speech. So that fame that he achieved from writing Hillbilly Elegy and the acclaim he got for the way he expressed it, the prose, I didn't see it reflected in the speech. I thought the speech was pretty boring. Or just not well written. I was really surprised by that. I was expecting a real eloquence that would offset Trump's trajectories that he goes on. But I was kind of disappointed. I still wonder, if you scratch the surface, what's really under there. So I'm not prepared to say that yet. Kamala has had a lot of experience.
JD Vance has undergone his own religious conversion, which would be very obvious, I would have thought. In a debate, it would be an ideal.
Yeah, I'm sure he would be well prepared. But I'm sure she would be too. But yeah,
the reason I'm so confident in him in debate, not only because I saw his Senate debates and he obliterated the field in his
Well, that's not hard to do.
But on
There-
top of that, he's kind of like the Republican Pete Buttigieg. Like Pete Buttigieg shows up on Fox News. He's the only Democrat who shows up on Fox News, and they cannot lay a glove on him.
Well, they
But-
wouldn't on Fox News. What do you?
No, on
No,
Pete
I'm sorry,
Buttigieg.
Pete
On
Buttigieg.
Buttigieg,
Sorry,
sorry.
Pete Buttigieg.
Okay.
Pete Buttigieg shows up on Fox News.
Yeah, yeah.
and they
Yeah.
can't touch him.
Yeah.
They're throwing whatever they can at him, and he doesn't even, not even a bead of sweat. He just bang, 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 a minute perfect answer every time, right? And and in the Democrat debates, in the Democrat Party debates, it was the same. He was just
Yes.
unflappable.
Well, that's why it became so popular.
And Vance does that on CNN all the time. He's been on CNN maybe 6, 7 times. He's
Yeah.
one of the very few Republicans who shows up on CNN, and they're trying to make to get under his skin. Nah, just like Buttigieg, just absolutely just a minute perfect answer. And so for that reason, I think he's made for debates.
Yeah, but
we'll see.
Kamala will get him on abortion, the issue. I mean, he's anti-abortion.
He is.
He's anti, exceptions. You know,
So-
he's,
It sounds to me like we need to do an event when we have the vice presidential debate, so we can
We will.
analyze and see what's going to happen. All right, is there another question? Sorry, yeah, we'll come right here to you, sir.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I came primarily to get the free speech from Chas, even though I was concerned about the Second Amendment. So
Okay.
I don't know whether we have a best. So I'm a bit of holistic critical thinker. So I'm going to shake your grounds. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Okay. So I'm asking here, why are we here in Australia, and what difference does it make who wins? All right, because I think from my perspective, for Australia, we have much more important issues to consider rather than going like a cheering for like a bullfighting race. So, as I said, we have to see what's behind this thing rather than just talking and so that's the key thing, particularly like just a one subtopic.
Sure.
When was mentioned that NATO is, I'm just pronouncing phonetically, is asking for more expenditure. The purpose of NATO diminished after the USSR failed. So obviously Europe would want to actually spend less rather than going into the militarization of the world, because there's better ways to solve the problems.
Yeah.
Beginning with China.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So in terms of how one or the other might affect Australia, I'm just trying to think of a couple of examples off the top of my head. I'll tell you one big difference between Trump and Biden, or whoever the Democrat is, would be that Trump is going to have massive tariffs on China. I mean, Biden likes his tariffs too, but Trump likes them more. And I'll tell you what happens when you place huge tariffs on a country like China. Those goods need to go somewhere. They're not going to America, right? Like Indonesia, for instance. I think just the other day, like 2 weeks ago, I think they slapped a huge tariff on China to protect their goods because they were sick of being the dumping ground for Chinese goods. They're going to go somewhere, and Australia might be the place they go. So it's the Australian government needs to work out what it's going to do when a massive volume of Chinese exports comes our way. So that is something that is an issue for Trump. It's not an issue for the Democrats. So that's just off the top of my head.
well, foreign policy, I mean, security. You want to talk about national
Sure.
security?
Yeah, I think
important that
a
is.
couple of things. One thing we've said many times here is that back in 2016, when Australia had an election and the US did too, that in terms of traffic and Google searches, there's twice as much interest in the US election as the Australian election. So one, we want to, quench the thirst for more information about the US. But I think another thing I'll say is as the US Study Center, one thing we do a lot is engage with Canberra and other capitals. And it's really interesting. We came out with a publication called Red Book, Blue Book a couple months ago, looking at what happens if Biden wins, what happens if Trump wins. One of the reasons we did that, though, is that I found as an American that as much as Australia focuses a lot on what China is doing, what's going on in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, they sort of take the US for granted and they don't really know the dynamics. And in my view, it is at this point more important for Australia to understand what's going on in the US than it is in China. Because I think we sort of know what China is at this point, to a certain extent. We sort of have an idea of what China wants to do, what it looks like, whereas the direction that the US is going is far more uncertain. So I think that's one thing that I think is of utility to understanding what's going on in the US. Now, beyond all that, I will say one thing that our CEO likes to talk about is the difference between structure and agency. I mentioned that Red Book, Blue Book publication we came out with. The longest component of that Red Book, Blue Book was not what happens under Biden or what happens under Trump, but actually what stays the same no matter what. Because so much of what is in the relationship between the US and Australia is structural. And it's going to be the same no matter what. No matter what, no matter who wins in November, the US is not going to have a completely different approach to China. It's not going to all of a sudden love China and think that's simply been misunderstood. No matter what, the US is not going to automatically think that NATO's, the European countries are getting, have done too much on security and the US should be paying more for security. There's so many structural things that are going to be the same no matter who wins. But then you get into the agency. And that's the thing that we have to understand. How much is enough to make AUKUS work? What does it look like to have tariffs from the US that are 60% on the world, as Chas said? What does it look like with a very different defense funding strategy in a Trump Vance administration compared to a Biden administration? What does working with friends and allies look like? How do you work with the Trump administration? And I think we saw in the Trump administration, some US allies work really well with Trump. I would say Japan and Australia in particular, and then some US allies really not work well at all with Trump. And I would say Germany and Canada in particular. And so I think it's to our advantage to understand how to engage with the US. There are some things going to be the same no matter what, but I don't think we should be cheerleading. I think we should be understanding to work with the new reality and try to understand, in my view, Australia's most important ally.
Now, I think I saw a hand here. Do you want to ask your question? Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Genevieve, an American. Need to get my registered to vote card. My question is, because I haven't been following, unfortunately not doing my homework, what are the Supreme Court dynamics and how is that going to influence potentially the election? I've heard that there's one of the representatives has put in something against one of the sitting, I'm sorry, I don't know the names, but
charges,
because
yeah.
of corruption and stuff. So I know there's been a lot of things passed that are really conservative, and so I'm not sure if things will change in that area.
I'll go to Chas first on this one because he's he's studied law and he's come on our podcast on a lot of these legal issues. But what's your take on that?
Well, I think that there aren't going to be any decisions between now and they've just finished their term, and the cases that they hear at the end of this year, they're going to return their rulings after the election. So they've already done their worst as far as the election goes. In terms of the impeachment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has filed impeachment articles. That's a Republican-held House. They're not going anywhere. But I mean, it's putting a marker for the future as much as anything else, because these are long-term battles that the Democrats are going to be having with the Supreme Court, I suspect. I suppose the only other answer I'd give to your question is the effect the Supreme Court could potentially have on the election is if there's some emergency petition for maybe something to do with either absentee ballots or like some kind of technical question, which there were quite a few of in the last election. Or maybe if there's a real humdinger again and Trump wants to pull his, oh, I didn't lose card. I've been really shaken by, and shaken is the word, by the ruling that the Supreme Court handed down recently about immunity. if I'd answered that question, if you'd asked me that question 3 weeks ago, I would have said, don't worry about it. They, in 2020, they were pretty much straight down the line. They ruled quite sensibly. They didn't take any of Trump's rubbish with his ambit claims
Except
and
for Roe v. Wade.
no, I'm talking about the 2020
2020
election.
right before that.
Yeah, it's yeah, like it's but honestly, the immunity ruling just now from John Roberts, I never would have predicted it would have been as hackish as it was, and it worries me. It worries me that we might be entering a new phase. So I think that is there is potential if it's a very close election and there's a very technical call that needs to be made, that they might make a hack call.
There's
Yeah.
also the president has indicated that he's looking at reforms for the Supreme Court, you know, looking at whether they could have put through an ethics.
Yeah, but they're not going to get votes. for
Yeah.
that.
No, they're not, but
Yeah,
it'll be part of the campaign, you know, to say why this election is so important. So the Supreme Court will certainly be a political issue.
I will say just very quickly that the conservative movement sees the Warren Court of the 1960s as a huge era of progressive activism from the Supreme Court. And now the conservative movement thinks it's their turn.
Yeah.
And also it's really important to note that there is nothing in the Constitution that limits the number of Supreme Court justices to 9. We might remember that in the early days of Joe Biden getting pushed to change the Supreme Court ruling, especially after Roe v. Wade, to a greater number. We're only going to see more pressure if there is a Democratic president.
Yeah, and I'll say that the thing that when you raised your question that came to mind for me was the 2000 election, which ultimately came down to the Supreme Court. They made the decision because there was a tie to break and a decision on how to rule on Florida with its rule count. So that would be the sort of maybe emergency thing or something. If that's the only time I think it's happened where the Supreme Court had to weigh in like that, but there was a tough call to make. They couldn't resolve it, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately made the decision.
In 2020, there were a number of cases that could have been like that, that they slapped down.
Yeah.
So that's why we don't think about them. But
Yeah.
they did the right thing then. But like I said, after that last immunity ruling, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're capable of, honestly. I couldn't believe that. I still can't believe it.
Now I think we've got time for one more question, if it could be a really quick one. Yes, maybe the gentleman over here.
Hoping mine would be quicker, but so as researchers, we try and avoid the question of conspiracy theories because we can't base them in truth. But obviously, since the COVID period, these kind of theories have had significant weight in people's minds and potentially voting. Can these kind of this way of thinking affect the election, or perhaps how much weight are they actually holding in voters' minds? And successful campaigns are mainly based on now countering the fake rather than the facts and addressing that.
Can I talk on this?
Yeah, if you can keep it quick, because Chaz has got to go. in 2 minutes.
Okay, no, well, this is such a good question because this really impacts just everything. Right now, there are, because of the Democrat infighting and decisions about Biden's future, the Trump campaign and other right-wing commentators are coming out saying, you know, they're trying to depose the president. This is a coup, you know, so there's all this suggestion that what they're doing is, illegal. It's, trolling them, but somebody will believe that. But even with the assassination attempt, immediately there were conspiracy theories or suggestions that, oh, he had one of those, films, set blood things that went off or something, I mean, it's really hard for a president or any leader, no matter whether you're in America or any other country now, to communicate with people in which they'll accept that information. We're just living in this age of disinformation and untruth. And this whole convention, I mean, you'd spend a month fact checking everything that people put out there. Even the president's speech needs a lot of fact checking. Just a lot of misleading information or purposely disinforming people or misinforming people. I think it's a really concerning time in politics, and that's why there's so much disruption in our politics. We saw it here with the voice referendum. We've seen it in campaigns as well. It's really hard, I think, for politicians to get their head wrapped around the fact that people just want you to do your job and get things done for the country. But we have to put up with these, and these conspiracy theories will, as long as the Democrat fight goes on about Biden, there'll be more about what his health is, what's wrong with him. And it's really hard for people to get together on one point of view anymore. I don't know how you ever bring a nation together under these circumstances without regulation of some kind.
I think that as far as, I agree with everything Kim said about the problem with conspiracy theories in modern society. I think as far as elections go, I think that there are two kinds of voter. There is the kind of voter that already knows which side they identify with, and they'll believe the conspiracies of their side. They don't handpick, oh, that's a plausible sounding conspiracy or theory. I'll go with that. No, whatever they're told to believe, they believe. Like whatever their peer group says, they go with. And so it doesn't change the vote for those people because they were voting for that side already anyway. It just reinforces what they were already going to do. And just this constant reinforcement in America of one side or the other side. But then there's the people in the middle, or the people, that's probably the wrong metaphor, the middle, because the people who are independent are often all over the place. They're not just necessarily in the middle. They could be to the far to the left or just incoherent. Those people there may be more susceptible to voting based on misinformation. And to be honest, from my perspective, I think the dog that hasn't barked yet in this election is the rapid radicalization of Elon Musk, who on Twitter, I mean, like he didn't used to be this biased. He's becoming more biased every single week, and now he's becoming hardcore biased, and he has a massive megaphone. And the reason he has a massive megaphone is not just because he owns the joint, but it's also because the way Twitter works these days is you get paid for if you are part of their program, you get paid for the number of retweets you get and views you get. The best way to get lots of retweets and views is to say what Elon Musk wants you to say, because he has the most followers. So if he retweets you, you get money. And so he has this bevy of bottom feeders who follow him around, just sending him memes that they want him to forward on so they can make lots of money, and they reinforce his bias. And he's in this little bubble, and it's just becoming more and more calcified with his little hero squad who are just worshiping him and giving him stuff to do. And I think it's affecting people. I really do. I think that is an enormous megaphone. Now, Twitter is probably becoming more right-wing generally. So the people who are independent may start to drop off after time. But I think it could affect this election. Like, I think it's going to be a few years before there's a huge drop-off. So I think, and why this is relevant is because there's a lot of misinformation and conspiracies that get elevated by Elon Musk. And so I think that's where it's most concerning from my perspective.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all. If you would mind joining me in giving a round of applause to our amazing panel. Thank you. It's been a great topic tonight. Chaz has to run, but the others can stick around a little bit. We've got some refreshments outside, so we'd love to stay and have a chat. Thank you.